It's the late morning on the Housatonic Railroad when we position ourselves at Berkshire Junction as the NX-10 crew makes its way back west after picking up 2 empty center beams from Sheapaug Lumber. The NX-10 is also seen with GMTX 229 today, as it was brought down by this morning's NX-12 to replace the Housatonic's GP7U, which went back up to Canaan for servicing. In order for NX-10 to continue their work, the 229 would have to be on the north end of the train. But with no place to run around plus 7 loaded gondolas from Oak Ridge Waste, work would be a challenge. Thankfully, the grade at Berkshire Junction is just enough to give gravity control of the 2 center beams, making running around the train faster and more efficient. Once the 2 center beams were clear of the switch, the NX-10 heads back onto the main to tie onto the center beams plus the 7 cars from Oak Ridge. Once tied onto the 9-car train, the NX-10 begins their trip back north on the Berkshire line, heading for their next stop, Farmco. A mile north of Berkshire Junction, the NX-10 is seen working once again, with power cut off from the rest of the train, plus 1 empty center beam, pulls ahead of the switch and backs down into Pharmco. Pharmco is a chemical manufacturer by Greenfield Global. Greenfield Global, associated with a variety of chemicals, produces products from alcoholic beverages to renewable energy. And since dealing with chemicals, NX-10 uses the first car as a buffer car to prevent any accidents to the NX-10 along with any future crew that would have them at the head end of the train. Since Pharmco has 2 unloading docks, the NX-10 has to make 3 moves to clear out the 2 tracks. Once ahead of the switch, the NX-10 heads back down the spur to fetch the last of the outbound cars. Once tied on, the NX-10 heads out of the spur and onto the side track, where they'll back down onto the stored cars that will replace the 3 outbound cars. Once tied onto the stored cars, the NX-10 pulls the stored cars to the north end of the siding to take out the inbound cars that will be spotted in Pharmco. Once the inbound cars are out of the siding, the NX-10 cuts the rest of the stored cars and pulls ahead of the switch that leads to the Farmco spur. Once ahead of the switch is realigned and the NX-10 backs down the spur to spot the first of the inbound cars. Once the first of the inbound cars are spotted, the NX-10 pulls ahead of the switch and realigns it to track 2 to spot the second portion of the inbound cars. Once the switch was realigned, the NX-10 shoves back down into Pharmco to spot the rest of the inbound cars. Once all the inbound cars were spotted, the NX-10 takes the remaining stored cars ahead of the switch to put them back on the siding and back into storage. Once ahead of the switch, the NX-10 shoves the stored cars back onto the siding. Since Farmco doesn't have the space to unload a great amount of cars at once, inbound cars usually sit on the side track that spans from Berkshire Junction to the Farmco spur. Farmco can only unload 4 cars at once, and until those cars are unloaded, the stored cars will remain on the siding. It also depends on customer needs, which can make those stored cars sit in the siding for an even longer period of time. Once the cars are settled in the siding, the NX-10 pulls out of the siding and back onto the main, to back onto the rest of their train and take it north to New Milford. Once tied onto their train, we move just north of Pharmco to watch the NX-10 depart with a now 12-car train that will be handed off to the NX-12. As the end of NX-10 makes its way out of Danbury, we move to Stony Hill Road, where NX-10 can be viewed crossing over Junction Road. From Junction Road, we move just east of the Brookfield Center, also known as Four Corners, where the station still sits along with one of the two tracks that once served the New Haven Railroad. From Four Corners, we move to the Brookfield to Milford town line on Old Middle Road, where the NX-10 continues north at a slow, steady pace. Continuing north into New Milford, we passed the NX-10 and beat it to our final spot, Harrybrook Park, before NX-10 enters New Milford Yard and tie down for the day. In New Milford yard limits, the NX-10 is seen, heading to the north end of the yard where they'll back down onto the 1 yard track. Once at the north end, the NX-10 realigns the switch and then backs down onto the 1 yard track. Once the train is spotted and tied down, that would conclude this day for the NX-10, and would also conclude our day on the Housatonic Railroad. And like always from the weathered rails, thanks for watching.